Hello, I'm Valerie Williams, Director of the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, within the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you for joining the second annual Smart Beginnings virtual conference. Smart Beginnings is designed to share information with OSEP stakeholders, which includes parents, teachers, early childhood providers, and administrators, as we start a new year of learning and discovery for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. The beginning of a new year of learning and discovery is a very busy time of year for everyone, and I want to thank you once again for taking time out of your schedule to participate in Smart Beginnings. The presentations range in length from 15 to 20 minutes and are designed to provide targeted, action-oriented information that we think will be of value to you. Several presenters provided information at our recent OSEP Leadership and Project Directors Conference held last month, and we asked them to share their valuable information and tools with you today. After the last presentation, we'll also have a question and answer session in which you can engage directly with today's presenters. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to our first presenters on day 3 of Smart Beginnings, Christina McDonald and Sarah Walters.
Welcome to Building Equitable, Inclusive Preschool Special Education Environments. I am Sarah Walters, and I am joined by my colleague, Christina McDonald. We are TA specialists with the IDEA Data Center. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of preschool inclusion and how we can address equity. We will emphasize the importance of using shared vocabulary and speaking the same language when it comes to describing the settings in which preschoolers with disabilities are provided special education services. We begin our conversation by providing some context for inclusion in our work. We then talk a little bit about vocabulary and how that impacts our understanding of inclusion and the data. We will wrap up with some tools to help address some potential issues and support you as you continue to do this work. Okay, let's talk a little bit about context and why this thing called inclusion is important. Decades of research has shown the benefit of inclusion for children with and without disabilities. To support and demonstrate their commitment to inclusion, in 2015, the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services issued a joint policy statement on the inclusion of children with disabilities in early childhood programs. This policy statement shares a vision for and provides recommendations to states, local education agencies, schools, public and private early childhood programs to ensure the participation of infants, toddlers, and preschool children with disabilities in high school and high quality inclusive early childhood programs. Additionally, in 2017, the Office of Special Education reaffirmed this commitment through a revised Dear Colleague letter offering specific guidance addressing inclusive preschool education programs and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requirements regarding least restrictive environment, or LRE, for preschoolers. At that time, OSEP noted that there had not been an expansion of inclusive early learning opportunities for children with disabilities. Unfortunately, the national data continues to show that inclusion in preschool has remained stagnant and even decreased during the height of the COVID pandemic. Why is this? Why is the data showing that the majority of services are being provided outside of the regular early childhood program? Is there some aspect of our special education or early childhood systems that is hindering the ability for preschoolers with disabilities to access services within their regular early childhood programs? Is this a reflection of what is happening for all children, or just for particular groups? Are particular groups excluded more than others? Are inclusion efforts not having an impact, or is something else going on? And what does all this mean about equity within our early childhood system? To get to the bottom of this, we need to start by understanding the data. Today, we will not be looking past this data and answering all of those questions, but we will start to investigate some possible reasons. There are many factors that impact the data regarding inclusion. As with any data set, high quality, accurate, and reliable data is a collaborative effort between states, education agencies, local education agencies, and other early childhood programs. Data regarding inclusion is generated through the Individualized Education Plan, or IEP, and it is based on the IEP team's decision and process regarding the least restrictive environment and the context in which the services will be delivered. The data is also impacted by how it is collected and handled at both the LEA and SEA, or the local and state level. Perhaps most importantly, the quality of the data is dependent upon how the data aligns with the designated values for the FS 089 EdFACS data submission for federal data requirements. I'm now going to pass the baton on to my colleague, Christina, and she's going to talk a little bit more about why vocabulary matters, provide you with some tools, and bring us home. Christina?
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, when we're talking about each of these steps in the process, vocabulary and terminology matter. So let's take a look at those factors again. When we're talking about what SEAs and LEAs need to understand and consider, what we're really talking about is the SEA and LEA having a shared understanding or shared definitions. They need a shared understanding about the IEP team's placement decisions. What do we mean when we say a regular early childhood program, a blended classroom, or a 50-50 classroom, or a public preschool? They need a shared understanding about the team's decisions about intervention settings. What does a regular early childhood program mean? And what constitutes a removal? They need a shared understanding of how data are entered and stored into the local and the state data system. Is the data being gathered from the IEP or IEP team meeting notes, or from a form or file review process? Is it compiled on paper, a spreadsheet, or a database software? Are there established permitted values for data entry, or is it open text? And perhaps the most important is how the data is being calculated and translated into the FS 089 value for federal reporting. Does this happen at the local level or at the SEA? Is it done by a person, or is it a function of the data system? SEAs and LEAs need to not only have a shared understanding of how they're reporting, they also need to have a shared understanding of what they're reporting. Indicator 6, the preschool environments data derived from the FS 089 federal submission, is comprised of 3 separate but related measures. And again, vocabulary matters. Indicator 6A measures the percent of preschool children with disabilities who attend a regular early childhood program and receive the majority of their special education and related services in that program. Again, we need to consider what constitutes a regular early childhood program. And is this a programmatic definition or a data definition? Indicator 6B measures those children who do not attend a regular early childhood program and instead receive their services in either a separate special education class, separate school, or residential facility. In this measure, what constitutes a special education class? And finally, 6C measures those children who do not attend a regular early childhood program and receive their services in the home. How is home for preschool different than homebound for school age? As we've seen, when we're looking at inclusion data, there's a lot of terms that need to be understood in order to collect, report, and interpret the data accurately. In order to accurately represent and use data regarding inclusion, we need to be defining and using those data in the same way. How do we do that? Well, one strategy is to use the Common Education Data Standards, or CEDS. CEDS is a national effort to determine common standards for key data elements and to provide standardized definitions. As we mentioned previously, one of the key factors influencing inclusion data are that the data systems at the LEA and the SEA level. These data systems may be the same or they may be different. And there's also a third data system involved, and that's the federal EdFACS system. Whenever we're dealing with multiple data systems, we need to ensure that these systems are speaking the same language, that the fields and data contained in those fields have the same structure and meaning. What does that mean in practice? Well, let's say we have 2 data systems. Both have fields for the student's ID. In the first system, the ID field is the student's 10-digit local identifier number. In the second system, the ID field contains the student's 10-digit state identifier number. While the data is the same format and structure, if we were to upload and report the data from the first into the second data system, it's unlikely that any business rules would flag any sort of error. As a result, the receiving data system now has a mix of local and state identifiers in the ID field. Anyone using the system to generate reports that pull data based on the student ID is going to get messy and inaccurate data. The system is going to combine records based on the student ID field. So if you have one student whose local ID is 1234 and another student whose state ID is 1234, their data is going to be combined. Another student whose local ID is 5678 and their state ID is 9248 is going to have their data split as if it belonged to two separate students. The data is going to be a mess, or as we say in the data world, the resulting data will lack integrity. It's not going to accurately represent what is occurring in practice, and worse, it will not be obvious. Unless something really odd shows up in the data or someone familiar with what the data actually should look like is generating the report, then it's likely no one is going to know that there's anything wrong. They will believe that the data is what it says it is, but that's not actually what's occurring. So how do we get around this issue? That's where SEDS comes in. SEDS allows us to define what the values in each system signify and match those to a SEDS definition. These common definitions provide a common language that data systems can use to compare how they define the data fields in their systems, known as their data dictionaries. SEDS not only provides these clear definitions, but it also has a variety of tools to help data system managers with the mapping process and using SEDS values to align data sets across systems. Once systems are aligned, then we can accurately connect data across systems and have confidence in the results. So now our data systems are using the same vocabulary, but what about the individuals working with the data? Are they using the same vocabulary? I'm happy to say there's a tool for addressing that too. It's called the Preschool Environments Toolkit, published by the IDEA Data Center. This toolkit provides materials and resources to help SEAs and LEAs establish a shared understanding of the vocabulary and how data associated with those terms are collected and reported. With that shared understanding, data can be entered and reported more accurately. This allows the SEA and LEA personnel to better analyze and use their preschool environments and inclusion data to examine potential issues of inequity. In addition to defining key terms such as regular early childhood program, the toolkit offers particularly valuable resource for building a shared understanding and vocabulary for the collection and reporting of environments data. It's called the Preschool Environments Decision Tree. This tree demonstrates how information about the learning environments in which a child engages is calculated and translated into the environment codes for the FSO 89 data file submission. The decision tree is a fantastic tool for building understanding of why the data is reported the way that it is and what it means. This makes it a perfect tool for SEAs and TA providers working with LEAs to understand or accurately report their data, as well as for working with partner groups, especially families, to build their understanding so that they can more meaningfully participate in target setting or other input sessions. For those who use a data software for generating their IEPs and reporting, this is also a great tool for data system managers to understand how to craft or troubleshoot a translation matrix needed to take the data from the IEP to calculate the FSO 89 values. The Preschool Environments Toolkit also has resources supporting state and local capacity to examine their data for the FSO 89 federal submission and analyze the data based on a variety of factors that go beyond what the indicator alone is able to show. This capacity includes the ability to look at environments or rates of inclusion by geographic region, school district, or various demographic categories, including age, gender, and disability, and race and ethnicity. Engaging in this deeper analysis can help states and LEAs surface patterns and potential inequities in inclusion rates and support a root cause process to meaningfully address factors impacting inclusion. The prerequisite for engaging in this type of analysis and for understanding and addressing why our national data for inclusion has not shifted significantly in the past 10 years begins with a shared understanding of the data. We need to be operating with a shared vocabulary and shared definitions to be sure that we not only understand the data, but that we can ensure its accuracy. Data that lacks integrity and doesn't accurately reflect practice provides a false start and will disrupt any efforts to make progress. Once we have confidence data is a mirror for practice, then we can use the data to address challenges and barriers impeding that practice and work to ensure that all children have equitable access to a free and appropriate public education, regardless of their disability status. Sarah and I thank you for joining us today, and we welcome you to reach out with any questions or for support in looking at your early childhood and environments data. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Beth Ann Vergine, and I work at the University of Connecticut Center on Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Today, I'm here to share our 326M Child Find model demonstration that is funded by the Office of Special Ed Programs. I recently presented this presentation at the Leadership and Project Directors Conference, so I'm going to share what we shared at that conference today. So this project is funded from OSEP, and our project officer is Yolanda Lucane. So in October of 2021, the OSEP funded 3 Child Find model demonstration projects. Ours at UConn is, we named it the Connecticut Family Support Tracking Referral System, and our abbreviation is Connecticut Family Stars. Also, there was 2 other projects funded, and that is Child Find Access, so advancing community center equity focused child find systems and supports, and then also a collective impact model for IDA Part C Child Find, and that is through West Ed. So our project, our purpose of applying for this grant is we identified in our state that there are many children referred to early intervention services, and out of a majority, probably about 45 to 50% of those kids are not found eligible. So families still have concerns about their child's development, but usually they feel that they've not been identified, so their concerns are not valid anymore. So our project was really focused on really meeting the needs and finding the children that did not qualify. So we wanted to make sure that there is a system put into place for one, we want to make sure that all families that have concerns about their child's development, that are infants and toddlers 0 to 3, that have an easy access to early intervention. And then if families that go through the intervention process, if they qualify, they go through getting an IFSP. Families that are not qualified, what systems can we put in place to continue the support of their development? So our purpose of the CT Family Stars is to build a state and community capacity to develop, demonstrate, evaluate, and replicate an interagent system so that we can track, identify, screen, and refer and monitor infants and toddlers who are at risk for having a delay or disability in Connecticut. So we have 3 model elements that we will do through the next 5 years. We're in year 2 right now. The first thing is to look at implementing an integrated data system across current data systems that are tracking children's for tracking and screening children from birth and system entry. So currently, in our year 1 of this project, we identified all of the current systems that agencies use in our state to enter child's information, whether it's screening information, if the child is referred to birth to 3, all the information that goes into that system. We do have a central access point in Connecticut through our 211 child development line. So all families referred to birth to 3 are then go through this 211 hub. Those workers at 211, they enter their child's information into one system, and then they enter the referral to birth to 3 that goes into another system, and then that goes to the towns that the family lives in. So birth to 3 agencies in that town. So there we've already identified 2 different systems that the family's information is getting entered into, and the systems currently don't talk to each other. We have other systems part of our Department of Public Health. Also our Department of Children and Families, our Office of Early Childhood has 4 systems that have early childhood information in them, and none of them talk to each other. So we've identified that there's multiple systems collecting information about children, but they don't record any screening information. And so how can we better identify and track those kids upon screening? So to be able to do this, we are going to use the ages and stages questionnaire to identify and monitor children's development. In Connecticut, we are currently in a year 3 of using a mobile app called Sparkler. And then in this app, parents can download it. They enter a code for CT, and then the families are able to complete the ASQ on their phone, on their mobile device. They can also use an iPad or an Android device. So families complete the ASQ, and then automatically the information goes to our 211 Child Development Info Line. They review it through a dashboard that Sparkler has developed, and then they contact the parents if there's any concerns on the ASQ, whether it's a monitor in 2 areas or it's a refer. So there's also 2 other ways that families can do the Sparkler. Our United Way 211 also has an online ASQ that families can do it that way, or they can use the old-fashioned paper. So we want to be able to meet more families to be able to do the ages and stages. And then upon really identifying more families being able to use the ASQ, we are developing currently a curriculum for a parent-to-parent outreach, because we want to increase parents and caregivers' participation in tracking, identifying, and screening, referral, and monitoring, and the evaluation of their child. What better than to have a peer, another parent, really talking about the importance of it as that parent has gone through early intervention services. So we just currently hired a parent consultant that is working with us to develop this curriculum, and then we will train veteran parents that have been through the early intervention process, and they will go out and work at our demo sites to connect with families. So our implementation phases, as we're in our implementation first demo site currently. So as I mentioned in the first couple of slides, we collected the data on our current systems for tracking young children. We then planned a demo site, and that is going to be in our capital city of Hartford. We will have 2 more demo sites, but currently we're working with Hartford. We've identified that in Hartford, there is a need for more identified screening for kids, and then also resources for families to refer them to if they are not qualified for birth to 3. And then phase 4 is going to validate and adapt those demonstration practices that we did in the other sites that we pick. And then in our final phase is to adopt and implement a tracking, identification, screening, and referral model for Connecticut. So we're really excited as we are going to really meet the needs of families. It's kind of been like a little bit of some detective work, and we've also opened a lot of, I would say, Pandora's box to find out information on what's going on in our current demo site in the communities, what parents are feeling about referrals to early intervention, what families are feeling about why they have to do developmental monitoring. So we've learned a lot in the last couple of years. So part of our phase 1 of our exploration, we did 4 focus groups to learn more about tracking and screening and the referral process in our state. Our first focus group was for birth to 3 providers. We did interview them to say that we did identify that already in that workforce, there was not any race and ethnicity to meet the families that we're working with in Hartford. So we identified that all of the providers were white. So we do know that is a need in our workforces to have more culturally appropriate birth to 3 workers to work with our families to be able to meet those needs. Our second group was families receiving early intervention. We asked them about the process. We also talked to families that were not eligible, and then families with no developmental concerns. So do they know what the referral process is? Do they know what to do if they had concerns about their child's development? The next thing is we did a survey for pediatricians in our Hartford, all of our Hartford programs, hospitals. We have community health centers, and then we have our Connecticut Children's Hospital, which most pediatricians are through both of those. We also surveyed childcare in Hartford to see if they are currently using screening practices in their programs. So just to review the families that were never referred to birth to 3. And so we asked them about how they felt about their pediatrician and if they listened to their concerns. And 20 of the families, all of them agreed that they felt the pediatrician really understood if they had concerns about their child's development. 18 of the families did say that the pediatrician did ask them questions about the child's development. 16 had said that child had a formal screening. 4 of the families said that pediatricians did conduct the screening, and 13 of them, most of them did not attend an early childhood program. And 18 of the families, so 90% of those families were not aware of the 211 Child Development Info Line, where they can get more resources for their child's development, also have access to the ASQ. So we knew there was a lot of information we needed to be out in the community. The next pool was families that received birth to 3 services. So 12 of those parents had received a referral from their pediatrician. So we were happy to hear that the majority of the pediatricians are making referrals to birth to 3. Also a conversation with our 211 Child Development Info Line. They also shared with us most of the referrals that they get are from pediatricians. 3 of the parents, they contacted 211 after their preschool teacher or their infant toddler teacher had concerns, but none of the parents identified that they did have a developmental screening at their child care facility. 11 of the parents felt that birth to 3 did ask for their input. Some of the parents didn't really understand the acronyms that were being shared with them during their assessment. So we do learn that we have to give families a real breakdown of what we're talking about. 7 of the families said that they felt the overall process for early intervention was positive, and they felt the overall process for eligibility seemed to be a little bit harder. The process was hard because the timeline in between the assessment and actually receiving services was more than 45 days. And they really were anxious. So they felt like it was just too long of a waiting period. Parents felt like providers needed to be more engaged with the children and more service time in their home. And they wish at the beginning they really understood what birth to 3 was. And the families that were not eligible for services, 11 of the parents had a referral from their pediatricians. Some of them had contacted 211 on their own. 13 parents had an assessed schedule with birth to 3. However, they were not eligible for services. 7 of those parents were still concerned about their child's development. We do know that those families were referred to Sparkler to continue completing the ASQ. And remember, the families that were in this group were 80% African American and 5 Latino, and their children were ages 9 months to 2 years old. As I explained earlier, the birth to 3 providers, we had 12 that work in the city of Hartford, and 100% of them were Caucasian. 7 said their role in intervention was special ed teachers, and the rest were occupational therapists. They were not aware if the child had a developmental screening prior to the referral coming through to them. So our next phase to get into our city of Hartford, we put together a steering committee. We finalized that our site would be Hartford, and then we convened a group of state and local stakeholders to develop a strategic plan to implement this community demonstration for ages birth to 3 in Hartford. And once we had completed the strategic plan, we developed a vision and a mission, and how would we meet the needs of the families in Hartford. So we have 4 work groups that we're working on right now, and one is a parent-to-parent work group. So in that work group, we are developing a curriculum so that we can work with parents, and they will take the curriculum, we'll train them, and then they'll go out into the communities and work with families around screening. We also have a screening and tracking and a data integration group, which we feel like those 2 groups kind of could merge together. We recently did a fantastic work group with different providers throughout Hartford. So we had Board of Ed, we had school readiness, we had the Department of Public Health in Hartford, we had the Mayor's Office for Young Children, we had the library, so multiple stakeholders in the city. And what we did was we asked them to write on a index card what system they use and what does it collect for their 0 to 3 children that they service. And we had them put it all up on a board. And then what we did was, after everything was up on the board, we took a string and we asked them to figure out which systems talk to each other so that they can identify child that's receiving multiple services throughout the city, so we're not duplicating information. And we only had one system that connected. So if you think about a family that has home visiting, a family that is currently in a school readiness program, so they're in multiple systems, and so they're probably collecting the same information, so which is causing a lot of information for families, lack of information for families. So in that parent-to-parent, with our screening training for families that will be through the training module, we'll be able to enroll at least 4 to 5 veteran parents that are able to go out and recruit families to talk to them about screening. And we want to make sure whoever we hire, they're culturally, racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse to meet the different populations that we have in Hartford. And then our last work group is our workforce work group, and we're working on the needs of the workforce in Hartford. We have identified there's been such a turnover in staff in early childhood centers, so that has impacted continuity in the classrooms. So our families are coming into the programs, and they may have different teachers, just a high turnover. And we're identifying that most of those workforce need training around the importance of developmental monitoring, screening, and then the referral system for young children. And then also how to support those families that have identified that they do not have a disability and that they don't qualify for early intervention services. And as I also mentioned, our parent-to-parent will be implementing screening through that veteran parent-to-parent model using ages and stages. So we're really excited. We're just finishing the curriculum right now, and upon that, we will be working out in the communities. So that is our presentation today, and that's where we're at. So we're excited to, once upon us finishing this first demo site, we'll have lots of lessons learned. We do know that currently in Hartford, we have about 6,000 children that are 0 to 3, and we know about half of them are in a early childhood program, whether it's home visiting, WIC, an infant toddler program, or a family childcare. So we do know that we still have at least a half of that 6,000 of families that we still need to go out into the communities and work with. So through this parent-to-parent model, we'll be able to identify that areas of Hartford that those families we haven't seen yet. So whether it's collaborating with our community health centers and making sure that children are getting their developmental screening and their parents are understanding what they should do if they have concerns. Also sharing information about early intervention. We always encourage families, if they have the slightest concern about their child's development, they can still call 211, make a referral. Even if the child is not eligible, there's tons of resources that can be given to the family to support around that developmental monitoring piece. And that's our presentation today. Our website for our partner in this project is our Connecticut Office of Early Childhood, so our early intervention services, as well as PATH, and then our UConn USED. I'm thrilled to be here with everybody, and thank you for having me.
Welcome to the question and answer portion of today's Smart Beginning event. My name is Al Jones. I'm Associate Division Director within the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. I want to join on screen with me, our presenters. And it looks like Virginie may have a connection issue. I haven't seen her pop on. She may be calling in. In any case, if you have questions, please use the question and answer button on your screen to input questions. We will cycle through those questions, and any questions we do not get to during this particular portion of the event, we will answer at the conclusion of the event and send the responses out to everyone. I'd like to begin with shooting off the first question to Christina and Sarah. And this question is from me. How do states get started with assessing equity in their current environments?
Thanks, Al. One of the first things, and Christina and when we did this presentation at the OSEP Leadership Conference, we had another partner on board, Tony Ruggiero, who was representing IDC, but also the CEDS group, the Common Education Data Standards group. And one of the things that we agreed upon from the get-go is that addressing equity and the relationship between what the data is telling us about inclusion really needs to be viewed in a systemic lens. That you can't just look at the data and say, yes, this is exactly what it's telling us, and that context is everything. And so one of the things that is really important for everybody to remember is that it all starts with the child and what that child has to say to us as the adults and the professionals. And I'm going to use the air quotes in the room because that includes families, that includes everybody who's working with the child. What are those child's needs? What are the family's wants and needs for their child? How do those needs affect the development of the individualized education plan or program and those goals that are written on that? From there, the team, with everybody I mentioned and anybody else, childcare providers that is pertinent to that child's life, need to start looking at what is the placement? Where would that child be if they didn't have a disability? I think is a very first question that needs to be asked. And what preschool environment did that IEP team choose in order to provide education services within? So you have to have things in place to have those conversations from the get-go. And then once that's decided, how does that translate into how that data is reported and where that setting is reported and how it's included in the data that gets sent to the state education agency? And so it's really important for the local education agency data to reflect accurately what is happening on the IEP and what is happening with those placement decisions as far as the setting goes. And is there a one-to-one match? And from then, how does the state then verify that the LEA's practices are really matching what they've reported in their data system. And so again, we're connecting all the dots. All of this is just continuously, and I can't not talk without my hands, so I apologize for that. But then once we get that and we have a good feeling about our system from this far, looking, it doesn't stop. The systems approach doesn't stop once we know what's happening at that local level. We can use that data to really look and see how preschool services are meeting the needs of children in the 619 program or the preschool special education program. And that data doesn't just get lost at that point. It isn't just something that we report to OSEP, never to be looked at again. We check off the box. It really is about how are we looking at that data? And what Christina talked about on the recording, are we drilling down to really look at, to see? And one of the first questions that came up was, has race been included in inclusion? And our students of color referred for special education and ultimately inclusion. And I definitely, this is when you start to look at that. And you start to look at it from the beginning as well. But once you know the data is good, you've got to use it. And then you can start identifying those potential barriers to high quality, accurate data, and gaining a common understanding or vocabulary about what's reported to OSEP around preschool educational settings, and then implementing anything that needs to be changed or tweaked or improved upon. And then it goes back to the child. But I think at the center of all of this is the child and the family and what is best for that child and family in terms of what their hopes and dreams are and how that child is presenting. And inclusion is, I've always said, if you can't get inclusion to work at early childhood, because kids are kids, and this is the most, I personally think, in Part C and then in 619, that's when you start the inclusion, and it starts with your system.
We have another question that just came in. How do I initiate this issue with my state, which is Texas, child find data? We do not have the personnel of teachers to serve early childhood needs. Where would I start working with the SEA or LEA?
I see this kind of as a hybrid question between what the second presenter talked about and what we talked about as far as inclusion. From an inclusion lens, talking with your school district right away, going into your early childhood system, going to your local community and finding out who and where preschool folks gather. I don't know how else to word that, but talk about and do a really strong assessment. So again, it goes back to the data so that you can take that data to folks who can help make decisions about how inclusion works and how to help teachers come into the field. It's definitely a bigger issue than just that local, but you can start at that local level. And if you've already done that, each state has a 619 coordinator and a Part C coordinator under IDEA. So pick up your phone. Now I'm going to get, hopefully those that are on the webinar today are going, Sarah, don't tell them to call me. No, they are not saying that. They're saying, please call us because we want to know and want to work together to make that happen. So
we have our next question that just came in. Do you have any data about exclusionary discipline in your state? I'm also wondering about exclusion of children birth to 3 with disabilities in child care centers.
I'm going to have Christina kind of, because I know she's done some real work in this area, especially in the preschool area, but go for it, Christina.
Absolutely. I think the answer to that question is it varies state by state. Different states have, let me back up a little bit. There's a lot of different programs that interact in the early childhood realm. You've got the Child Development Bureau and, their funding through the CCDBG, which is the Child Care Development Block Grant. You've got Head Start, you've got IDEA funds, you might have school district funds, and each of those funding sources comes with different definitions for some of these data pieces. So what constitutes an in-school suspension when you're in early childhood? What does that look like? And do they even need to collect it for their funding source? Because a lot of programs don't collect data that their funding sources don't drive. So it's really going to come down to what's happening in your state. Does your state have some sort of initiative across these programs saying, we want to collect this data? And then are those programs coming together at both the local and the state leadership level to say, all right, let's talk definitions. What is in-school suspension in Head Start? What is it in your public school? What is it in your childcare? And really come to terms with those language. And then how are you going to collect that data? And then from there, that's where you can really start to have this question around disproportionality, because you are collecting the same types of data and saying, are there patterns? And are there patterns by type of program? Are there patterns by demographic characteristics? Are there patterns by regions in our state? Are there patterns by age? You know, what's going on there? And from that place, that's when you can start saying, okay, so if these patterns are happening here, then why? And that's a really great place to really bring your stakeholders in and say, all right, let's talk about this. What are you seeing from your perspective? What are you seeing as a teacher? What are you seeing as a parent? What are you seeing as an administrator? What are you seeing as a related services provider? And really be able to get to those whys and say, what are some of those barriers in our systems that are then leading to this? You know, are our providers not being trained enough in positive discipline? Are administrators not feeling that they have the capacity to support their providers in those positive discipline strategies and techniques? Do they have the resources accessible to them? Do they have consultants that they can call when they're experiencing some really challenging behaviors out of a child and they're not quite sure what to do about it? You know, do they have psychologists that they can call? Do they have behavior specialists? You know, do they have access to that? And then, you know, depending on what level, you can start to address those separate issues. So I'm hoping that answered your question.
And we have a follow-up to an earlier question related to race and inclusion data. And this follow-up is what they are asking was, were you seeing a higher referral of children of color compared to their peers who are white? I ask this because students of color seem to make up a larger portion of special education in school systems, at least where I live.
And I know Beth Ann isn't here, but we might be able to answer that a little bit for her. So we're going to jump in and we're going to welcome Beth Ann to correct us later on based on her system. But really what I'm going to say is that goes back to your local child find data. And if you do happen to collect that child find data at the state level, then you can have access to that. And it really comes down to tracking the difference between those referrals and those that move beyond referral. So you can start looking at, one, as Beth Ann mentioned, where are the referrals coming from? Who's referring them? Do they have access to being able to identify if there's potential issues? Do they move past that referral? You know, do they get referred and then screened out? And then what happens? I know that's something in New Hampshire that we were really looking at in terms of the transition from Part C to Part B. These children that were eligible for Part C, which has different eligibility characteristics than Part B, they would be referred to Part B and then found ineligible. And then, you know, what we wanted to test in our data system was, do they then come back at age 6 or age 7, you know, having not been found eligible for preschool special ed, but then come in with a disability later on.
Right.
So, you know, those are some of those pieces where you really have to look at it. IDEA does not collect that, you know, referral information by race, but that doesn't mean that your state doesn't. So you want to, you know, have those conversations within your state and say, what data do we have available to us that goes beyond what we report to OSAP?
And I will say, I was the prior Part C coordinator for the state of Kansas. I can only speak to what we were doing 7 years ago when I was there, because I don't want to speak for what's currently happening. We did collect referral data in the Part C program, where those referrals came from and that sort of thing. And I will say, based on what was happening 7 years ago, and I have no reason to think that it's changed, but again, I can't speak to that. The referrals were lower for children of color, and the child find, we had to work harder to get that. So it was kind of the opposite. The disproportionality was that we saw, although that's not a word that's used in Part C, but it starts as far down as that, is that we were getting fewer referrals for Black and Hispanic children and those kinds of things. So we had to work really hard in our child find system. Again, I can't speak for what was happening back then, but now it's more of, and there's lots of reasons that could be for that. And I think it has to do with the access to probably healthcare, all kinds of things. I could wax poetic about that for a really long time, but I won't.
Our next question in the Q&A pipeline. In my state, I feel like we need to get a handle on the workforce pipeline in college. How many students are pursuing early intervention, early childhood, special education related degrees, and how many are graduating each year? Are there any exemplar states or models that you could point to that have a robust workforce pipeline and need data collection systems?
That's a really good question. There is the Early Childhood Personnel Center that you could probably go, and I can probably find that link and pop it into the chat so somebody can pop it in so you all can see it. But they might have some really good information for you around that. It's actually through the University of Connecticut and Mary Beth Bruder, who was also part of the demonstration project that was presented on as well. But that's definitely something that I've heard in the pipeline, that a lot of states are dealing with staffing shortages, representativeness of staff, all of those kinds of things. And so I think that's something that states have started to look at even more closely. And like many things, I think the pandemic probably shine. English is failing me right now. My grammar, my aunt, the English teacher, is like cross town fussing at me right now, but it's shined a light on it really, that it's even worse than we thought it was. So
I will also add that here at the department, after the event, we will share additional resources related to all of the questions. So we'll also give all the presenters a chance to also follow up with written responses for all of the questions. The next question, I really appreciate the questions you are referring to. What, why, and how the data is working. Do you know if there is a source that has some of these wonderful examples? Questions.
So I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding the question, so I will do my best to answer it. And if I get it wrong, please throw something back up in the Q&A and let me know that you're asking something else. So if I understood the question, you were looking for what are the types of questions we need to ask of the data in order to be able to get at this information. And I can tell you that that preschool toolkit that I was talking about in the recording actually has on the data analysis page sample questions from basic to expert, and it will show you how to use the calculator. So if you're not Excel savvy and you're afraid of something called a pivot table, it will give you step by step, what do you need to put, where do you need to put it to answer those questions for you based on your own data. Now that does work for Part B data. It is not a Part C tool, but if that's something that you're looking at for preschool special ed, that will certainly give you some ideas of questions to ask. I do know that the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center also has a bunch of questions on their website. And Daisy has a group as well. And I know that they've just done a revision around integrating some equity questions in there. So those may also be helpful to you. So hopefully that's what you needed from that question.
And if not, please feel free to clarify with an additional question in the Q&A, and I'll pick it up immediately. And these next two questions, I think, refer back to the earlier discussion on race and inclusion. What were your findings in New York and in New Hampshire? And if I got that wrong for the person who was asking this question, let me know.
Chris, do you want to?
So I can try to answer for New Hampshire, and I will tell you first and foremost, it is very, very difficult to do that kind of analysis with any level of confidence in New Hampshire because we are 96% white and only 4% other races. And the majority of those 4% lie in 2 communities in our state. So it's a little bit harder when you're talking about a community that has an entire preschool program of 12 kids, and they might have one child who happens to not be white, to be able to say strictly from the data that we have an issue. Now, that said, that's where those stakeholder conversations come up. And you start looking over years as opposed to a single year. There are strategies to get around those small cell size, and we would definitely leverage those. We hadn't found explicit patterns outside of those larger communities. We did find some there. What we did find was a lot more disproportionality in our communities in terms of identification rates of particular disabilities. So we had one community that was identifying intellectual disability at 4 times the state average. So there were pieces that were coming up in that area. We had certain communities that identified boys more than they identified girls. So we were very careful to say, okay, so we're going to go this far and then go down to the LEA level in terms of some of the other demographic categories. But we get a state, we can look at regions, we can look at gender, we can look at disability category, we can look at the age that they're coming in, you know, so we did not stop. And we didn't let the questions go, and we would pursue and peel back those layers and then work with our LEAs to help them have the ability to look at it too within their own context, so that we could try to surface some of these items.
Okay, and I have a clarification on the question. It wasn't new 2 states, it was only New York. The second state was a typo.
Unfortunately, I can't speak to New York, but I'm guaranteeing you that they're digging into this pretty much the same way that New Hampshire was, and they start kind of at their own levels and start peeling back those patterns.
This next question, do you have any data about exclusionary discipline in your state? I'm also wondering about exclusion of children birth to 3 with disabilities in child care centers.
I think so. That data is harder to come by. As birth to 3, there's that to my knowledge, I don't know of a data collection system that actually collects that. Your Head Start and early Head Start programs will have some sort of information about children that were asked to leave, you know, those kinds of things, but there really isn't a great data system right now. And that is one of the, I'm just going to say it, one of the holes in our early childhood system. I'm just going to acknowledge it, not just special ed, but in general. The Office of, oh, help me out here, Christina. The, why did it just escape me? Civil Rights sometimes collects some of that data. Thank you. It took me a second. My brain just had a moment. It collects some of that, but I have not seen any recent data.
Yeah, and really, I think what it is at the federal level, it's not being collected. There are some states that are doing a really good job. If you're in a state where there's a statewide initiative around this, and there are a lot of them that have popped up over the past decade, where they've kind of come together and said, no, we want to have a state picture of what's happening in early childhood around discipline. They may be collecting that. So now the question is, you know, what agencies it collected through? Is it collected through both and then combined? Are they using the same definitions? You know, you're going to go down that trail again, but definitely look into whether or not your state is collecting that. And that at least will give you that crack in the door to be able to get in and get a look at that. But nationally, that's not something we collect outside of the OCR surveys. And that's not a persistent question in each of the OCR surveys. So.
And our next question, for a child who is found to be eligible under Part B or Part C for services in a state that does not have universal preschool, who ultimately is responsible for finding a program to implement the IEP or IFSP?
So I'll kind of field that one. Both Part C of IDEA and Section 619 and Part B, for that matter, have child find responsibilities. And so your state lead agency for Part C or your state special education state education agency should have a system in place for finding those children. And ultimately, you can't say it's just one person's ultimate responsibility. It's the community. And however, looking at what those child find requirements are within both of those really does involve the coordination of that child find is really at the state education agency level, and which may be then pushed on to the local education level in the case of a state, depending on how it works. And then at the Part C level, it really is the lead agency for Part C of IDEA that's responsible for child find. And again, they should have policies and procedures in place for making sure that those things are happening. So it's that single line of responsibility.
And to piggyback on that, I think I heard something about in terms of the environments in which the children are being provided services. And both Part C and Part B basically start from, in Part C, it's called the natural environment, and then work out. In Part B, it's called the regular education environment, and then work out. So the default is that environment where that child would be in the absence of a disability. And then look at the services and supports that can be provided to them within that context. And then from there, if those services and supports can't be provided in that context, in other words, it won't help the child be able to function and grow and achieve directly in that environment, then they'll start looking at more segregated settings, but they start at that natural point and move out. So when you come to a school district that does not have a public preschool, or a state that doesn't have a public preschool, you're looking at where is that child in the absence of a disability. If they're at Sally Sue's daycare down the street, then that's the regular ed environment. And you start to have that conversation of, all right, can we provide services in that regular environment? And will it help them access what's known as the regular education curriculum? And, you know, some of the conversations in a school district might be, well, Sally Sue's daycare doesn't have a curriculum that meets our early learning standards. So there is no access to a regular ed curriculum in there. And so they may have that conversation and say, well, you know, we want to do it over here so we can ensure that that child has access. Those are local conversations. I can't stand here and say, you know, which is the better option. It's a child by child decision and a program by program decision. But you start where that child would be in the absence of a disability. That's their natural or regular ed environment. And then from there, you start to say, okay, can we support them to stay in there and fully access the curriculum or developmental activities in the case of Part C? Or do we have to, and then justify that, pull them out to a more segregated setting? I hope that helps.
And our next two questions, I'm going to read them together. There's one primary question and a clarification. I'm a parent of a 3-year-old girl with a disability. My question is about the data that was shared by the first presenter, who showed that percentage of preschool students with disabilities educated in an inclusive setting has been stagnant for the last several years. What is the state's motivation to make this change? And a clarification to that question, I'm wondering what is keeping states accountable to make progress? My state, Michigan, was found to be in the bottom 5 states in our nation for preschool inclusion, but I haven't been able to find what is keeping my state accountable to make progress.
That's an excellent question. And Christina, we could probably tag team this one for sure. And so part of the data that is collected that we showed in our presentation is data that was directly reported by states. It was this nationwide data around this preschool settings. Part of what the Office of Special Education Programs does is they take that information and all of the data that is presented to them. And I'm going to let somebody from OSEP jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But that's all part of their differentiated monitoring and support 2.0 that's happening as they drill down into those kinds of things. But then each year, each state is provided with a determination on whether or not they meet the requirements of IDEA and if they're meeting their obligation based on different factors that I'm not going to get into today. But one of the things is looking at that data and seeing where a state is. And and those settings data is part of that process as well. So it's factored in at some level within that. It's not the whole picture though that gets, so states are motivated to look at that. And then I would say the next level that it really is your state education agencies have to make it a priority, and they have to really make that something that they then hold their locals accountable for too. And all the whole systems thing that I talked about in that very first question plays into that as well, because if you don't have good data in place to know if what is actually being reported really is representative, that's not great. And I'm going to do the shameless plug. IDC has that preschool environments toolkit that can help states really drill down into that, and each state has a technical assistance contact through IDC, a state liaison who can really help them drill down into some of that. But it really ultimately, and then I'm going to also say it's not a top-down thing, it's a bottom-up. Parents have to start holding accountable. I think I'm going to get on my little bit of a soapbox. We know that the special education laws that have been passed over the years and from all the way back into the 1970s are because parents have stood up and said, this is what we want and this is what is best for children, and working together with everybody. But I think parents need to start demanding it. And when those evaluations happen at the individual child level, the parents saying, all my kids go to this preschool. Do you think maybe we could, have our special ed services in that setting, and just start having those conversations with your teams that are doing the evaluations and such? So, Christina, anything to add, or Al, did I misrepresent anything?
No, you did not represent. You did a great job. So within the department, we have three major activities we do to keep states accountable for IDEA and its regulations. That's the annual performance reports that states turn in each year with data. There are also a differentiated monitoring system in which we will visit all states and territories for in-depth on-site monitoring that looks at several different data points. And the last is our grant application that every state and early intervention program system applies for grants that requires them to assure us they are meeting IDEA and its regulations for Part B and Part C. So those are our three main arms that we use to keep states accountable. And then we also, as you mentioned, require states to do their parts in maintaining accountability. And we fully support all stakeholders in either highlighting anytime there's non-compliance and working with their local education or early intervention center to correct that non-compliance. So that's the general gist. So I think, Sarah, you did an excellent job in saying the same thing. Christina, is there anything that you wanted to add?
I think there's one more layer I want to add to it, is I don't think anyone in the field is trying not to be inclusive. I mean, there might be some exceptions. What we're really running into is we're hitting this point where we really finally have some good data, but we have to know how to go from good data to change. And that's getting at that why. So, okay, so our inclusion level is really low. Why? And we have to know how to go about that root cause analysis process. And that's one of the things that IDC tries to do with the states, is we try to give them that capacity and that process and that support to be able to dig into that data and say, what are the policies or the structures or the barriers that are getting in the way of us doing inclusion? Is it because we're an extremely rural state that is a childcare desert and we don't have public preschool? Do we not know where to put these kids? Well, if that's the case, then, you're going to need some state involvement to help overcome that barrier. Or is it just, this is the way we've always done it in a particular school district or something like that? So you have to really ask that why in order to be able to address it. Because it's one thing to say we have a problem, and it's another thing to say what the problem is. And without knowing what it is, you can't address it.
I'm pleased to say that Beth Ann Virgin was able to join us by phone. You want to?
I'm here.
Great. Okay, well, I'm going to take a minute. There were several questions that came in for you early on. So I'm going to take a minute and cycle through some of those questions for you. The first one,
Okay, great.
is there a sample of what ages to stages, what the questionnaire includes?
Is there a
So it's-
sample of the ASQ?
Yes. So they're asking, are there samples of anywhere that they can look to see what kind of questions are there, what it includes? The ages to stages questionnaire.
So the ages and stages questionnaire is available online. You can purchase an ages and stages kit, but I would just Google it, the ASQ questionnaire, and then it'll bring you to the site where you can review the questionnaires. Some states have an online version, so they just click into the link, and then that link will take them to an ASQ. I do know in Connecticut we have one through our United Way, but most people can just go into the Ages and Stages website and get one.
This next question, it came during your actual presentation. The time frame for early intervention, early childhood is rather finite. Are you worried you will be missing some of the flaws if you do not continue tracking into early elementary school ages?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I
Okay.
do believe that we should still continue to monitor children past 5 when they go into kindergarten. Recently in Connecticut, they just changed the kindergarten entry age to 6. So that's going to actually give us more time to monitor children prior to going to kindergarten. So adding a whole nother year of 5. But yes, I believe that that's super important. But in Connecticut, all children have what's called a SACID ID number, which they get when they enter into birth to 3 or pre-K special ed. So that number follows them through their whole public school. So that will be a way to track them.
The next question for you was related to your engagement with parent centers in your work. How is that? Has that occurred, or do you have examples of that?
So currently, right now, we're developing a curriculum so that we can do a parent-to-parent model. So going out into our first demo site city, which is Hartford, and being able to train families on what developmental screening is, what is early intervention. So right now, that's what we're in the process of doing. But I've also done a lot of community outreach to all programs that serve, whether it's family resource centers, childcare, WIC offices, places of worship. And so connecting with all of those programs so we can do more outreach to families. We have learned that some families are not really going out into the communities and doing as much things as they used to before. So we're trying to navigate how we'd be able to work with those families as well. It's not an easy task, but we're trying.
Thank you. You're doing an excellent job not being able to see and only listen. You're doing great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So this next question, because I know I'm hitting you with a lot of questions at once. Is your parent-to-parent support provided in a diagnosis specific way? For example, autism diagnosis supports a family with a suspected autism diagnosis.
No. So our parent-to-parent model is to encourage families to follow through with any early intervention. So the parents that we selected to be the support parents have gone through early intervention. They know what it's like to have services. Either they've followed early intervention into pre-K special ed, so Part B. So these families have been through the process and their kids have been diagnosed. They're there to support families to understand why it's important to do screening, monitor your child's development. If you're at any concerns you have about their development, call our 211 central access point for early intervention, make a referral. If you're concerned, if your child is 3, here's the number to call to have scheduled for your child to have an evaluation. It's more of guiding families. I don't know that some families might feel comfortable with someone saying, another parent saying, oh, your child is definitely like on the spectrum. That might just cause more anxiety for a parent. So it's more of guiding them like, this is an easy process, important monitoring, and just if you're concerned about your child's speech, let's just make a referral. Even if your child's not eligible, here's some strategies that we can work. We can connect you with a family resource center or home visiting program that will continue to monitor that child's development, because all of those programs do ASQs. So they'll continue monitoring. So it's more of like a guide.
Thank you so much, Bethany. I'm going to cycle us
You're
back
welcome.
into the questions that are coming to the Q&A, and this next one is for Christina and Sarah. And
Okay.
this goes back to what about Native Americans? How do they show up in the data that you talked about?
So, Christina, were you going to go?
I thought this one would aim at you, but I can certainly go if you want me to.
Either way.
Go ahead.
So within New Hampshire, I can't speak to it. I'll let you do that. But one of the data points that is collected on child count has to do with all of the races and ethnicities and so Native Americans have their own place to identify, and hopefully the data will reflect that. So it is reflected in the data as its own separate category for Native Americans. So.
And this next question was a clarification of an earlier question about the OSEP parent centers, and it relates to OSEP funded parent training and information centers. So I can answer this one and say that we will provide additional information to answer this question at the conclusion of the event. We can definitely provide resources to answer that question. The next question, do private schools use the ages and stages? I'm in Oregon.
I don't know the answer to that. I hope that any program that serves children 0 to 5 does the ASQ, but I don't know the answer. It's a really good question.
Okay. I have a question for Christina and Sarah. Do either of you have any experience using CEDs, Common Education Data Standards?
Yes, actually, I do. So when I was in my state role in New Hampshire, I started off as the coordinator for early childhood data system. No, our special education information data system. And then I moved into being the 619 coordinator. So in my early role as the data coordinator, we had 2 systems going on. We had our state longitudinal data system over here, and then we had our special education information data system over here. And our special ed information reported everything to OSEP, and our state longitudinal data system reported everything else to the feds. And we wanted to start doing some analysis on our data, some of this looking at patterns, where are we serving kids, what's happening. And we found that there were discrepancies between the 2 systems, because the way that the state longitudinal data system got our special ed counts was a self-report from the school districts. And those counts didn't match what was in our special education data system. And we found through an audit process that the racial categories in our special education information system didn't match what was in our state longitudinal data systems. So we brought our data team, we called them the upstairs group, because as you know, in most of your states, you're in either different bureaus or a different building or something. So we brought them together with our vendors for our information system for special education. And we very quickly found that we were not talking the same language. Our data folks in the department did not understand special education data. They didn't understand the nuances that went into it. They really quite simply wanted to know, well, are they special ed? Are they not? And they got really frustrated when we said, well, how do you define special ed? You know, are you saying, are they eligible? Are you saying that they have an IEP? Do you want to count kids that have a services plan? Are you talking about, are they receiving services? You know, do you want to count them if they're eligible on an IEP when they come into school in September, but then are returned to regular ed in October? You know, and we just kept going around and around and finally came up with our own definitions that got us through for about a year. And then we had staff changes. And we had to start the whole process over again and orienting people to what this meant in order to connect these two systems. And then we met, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but Bill Hunneman over at the Center for Integration of IDEA Data. Thank you. And he introduced us to SEDS, which is the Common Education Data Standards. And this was like an aha moment for us. And it was concurrent to a time in our state where a law passed where anyone involved in education, SEAs, LEAs, had to publish data dictionaries for every data system to which they were providing student data. So it was we're very big on understanding what data we're collecting on our children in New Hampshire. So we worked with our vendor while our SLDS folks worked with CIID to map everything to SEDS so that we could start bringing these two data systems together and really truly have our special education information system as the authoritative source for who was and who was not considered to be special ed, and our state longitudinal data system considered to be the authoritative source for the racial and demographic categories, because typically information coming up from the school districts for the SLDS, that was based on parent registration at the schools. Whereas with special ed, depending upon where they were and what their school policies were, it could simply be based on somebody looking at a child and making a guess. So we defined those sources, and because we implemented SEDS, we were able to bring the systems together and make sure that our data was a lot more sound, a lot more accurate, and then we could start looking at, you know, where were these patterns that we wanted to dig into more.
Thank you. Beth Ann, this next question is for you. How do you connect with families in high need areas?
So the Hartford, our first demo site in Hartford is a high need area. We identified that there's 6,000 children between the ages of 0 to 5. We know that about 3,000 of them are in an early childhood program. So a school readiness program, childcare, family childcare. So there's still another half a chunk of families that we still haven't been able to connect with. So that's why we're going through all avenues of WIC offices. We're also, parishes, so churches, places of worship, and then really advocating using our parents that are our support parents who are from and they know families are where they're hanging out and where they're going. So that's where we're hoping to get some of those families. Large events, like we just had a big school event for Hartford the other day, which is like 10,000 kids. And so we were able to meet other, families that had smaller kids who not necessarily are in a program due to expenses and the cost of it, like childcare. So really doing a lot of outreach at different community events has helped us connect with families.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow up that question with the second one for you, Beth Ann. I think it's related. how do you identify the systems in your state?
Well, I became a bit of a detective. When this project started, I dove into every agency that serves children 0 to 5. And I went and did outreach to all of the people that would be appropriate to talk about the data systems. And so here's an example. We have one state agency that serves 0 to 5, and they have 4 systems that of children of what services they provide for children, and none of those services connect. For example, birth to 3, that's one system. Home visiting, that's another system. Then you have school readiness, that's another system. So I've identified in all of these systems, none of them talk to each other. So, and then when we go into our demo site, they have at least 30 systems. We did an activity where we have them all bring their, they wrote their systems down on an index card. And then when they all hung them up on the wall, we took a string connected. And out of the 30 systems, only 2 connected. So we've heard a lot of providers talk about they're entering kids' information and assessment data or evaluation data in one system, and then they have to enter it into another state agency. So 1, it's work time. 2, it's too many entries into systems, and then they all don't talk to each other. So it's been an interesting process for me to learn and be able to come back to all of these agencies and talk about how are we monitoring kids when we have all these different systems meeting different needs of different funding and different agencies. So that doesn't really help.
Thank you. Christina and Sarah, this is a follow-up question to the SEDS question, the Common Education Data question. Is it only for education or does it apply in other fields?
I can take this one, Sarah. It actually is usable across a variety of fields. There are a few different types of data standards out there, but Common Education Data Standards is by far the most prevalent one in any education or related field. So similar to what Beth Ann was talking about, in New Hampshire, we started to do the exploratory process for an early childhood integrated data system. And Preschool Special Ed was a big partner in that endeavor. And having been the former data manager, I and gone through the years of torment that we went through just within our own department, SEDS came on the table pretty quickly. Because across the 2 agencies, you know, similar to what Beth Ann said, we're talking 30, 40 different systems, some of which I'm scared to say publicly, but we're still DOS based. And we had been told by those developers, we couldn't adjust anything so much as character length in those fields without bringing the whole system down. So we knew we had to find a way to do some sort of translation matrix across all these systems. And SEDS was the way to develop that sort of architecture in order for us to be able to say, you know, what are the data fields in foster care? How does that relate to TANF? How does that relate to what the Child Development Bureau has? How does that relate to what special education has? How does that relate to Part C? So that we could kind of begin having that process. So it was great that we had it across all of those different organizations to be able to do that.
And I will say that in the last year and a half or so, maybe even a little bit longer than that, this Common Education Data Standards has been kind of doing a really close look at the early childhood Common Education Data Standards. And so those are definitely involved people outside of the state education agencies, the Part C. It involved childcare. There were different stakeholders that came together and really reviewed what was in there for early childhood. And that has been updated and is continuing to be looked at and updated. So yes, it is for people outside of education and those who are in their childhood care, child care, and those types of entities.
I think with that question, we have cycled through all the questions that are coming currently in the Q&A. I'll give a minute for anyone who wants to enter in any last question into the Q&A, and I'll pose that. If anyone does, so I'll take a second to do that. And if I missed a question for Beth Ann, that might have come in early, clue me in the Q&A section. I think I caught them all, but if not, let me know. And we do have an additional couple of questions that have come in. Can you describe the discussions around PII, personal identified information, and parental consent for sharing information in these initiatives?
Beth Ann, do you want to answer that, or would you like me to jump in on my end?
I will let you jump in because we haven't gotten that far.
Okay. Well, I can tell you, because our early childhood integrated data system is not built in New Hampshire, we were still in that sort of figuring things out. That was one of the biggest conversations on the table, not only because we were dealing with HIPAA on one side of the fence and FERPA on the other. We also have some very unique laws in New Hampshire around child data and student privacy that created certain opportunities and tied our hands in other ways. So there were a lot of conversations around, well, what exactly do we need to share? Why do we need it? What are those case examples? What are the questions that we're going to be asking? And then the secondary piece to that was the data governance structure, really looking at DHHS's data governance structure, DOE's governance structure, and saying who has access to the data, who can look at what, who can't, how is that access given, how is it reviewed, and all of those controls to be able to say in the proposals that we're going forward, all right, this is what data is going to be in there. This is how it's going to be used. This is who's going to have access to it. And this is why. And the why is the really big piece when it comes to both HIPAA and FERPA in order to be able to give parents an opportunity for informed consent. So they need to know what's being shared and why. So those were the pieces that were really being wrestled around. And it's definitely not something to take lightly. It's definitely very detailed. But I would say, you know, look at your rules, look at your laws, and then look at why you're pulling it together. And then from there, you know, you can work on how do you determine what needs consent and what does not.
I'm going to go back in the
And
way
if
back
I-
time. Oh. Go ahead, Beth Ann.
Sorry.
Go, Beth Ann.
So I just want to add something. So in Connecticut, this is so important, I think, to this conversation. So in Connecticut, our Office of Early Childhood is funding an app called Sparkler. And in this app parents download the app on their phone and they can do the ages and stages questionnaire. And then it goes directly to our 211 child development line. And then they contact families if there's concerns on the ASQs. And so in that conversation, a lot of families, when we're talking about tracking and information, a lot of families hesitant because they don't want their information out there. What's interesting, recently, I did some work with some home visiting programs around the developmental screening, and she shared with me that, talking about her families, and that most of the Caucasian families are fine with downloading the app and having the information with OEC, our Office of Early Childhood, and to United Way. Hispanic families were fine, but they've seen more of a, for African American families, they don't want their information out there. So as we learn to ethnicity of families that are comfortable about information sharing, really is going to help drive some of the work that we do if we think about an integrated data system, because some families signing off to that, their information being out there, really has struggled with it. So I just thought that was important to share.
Absolutely. And I was going to go back in my way back time machine again and talk about what we were doing in Kansas at the time with longitudinal data systems and connecting the Part C program to the 619 and Part B data systems. There's certain data around transition And each state does it a little bit differently. They have to have some, so you have to look into this. It's one state. In our state, there's specific data that has to be shared around transition with the 619 local education agency and the state education agency. If that and it's very specific, very narrow data, like it's to help the state, and each state gets to figure out if they have an opt-out policy for families. So that's why I'm saying this could be very different in any other place that you look. In Kansas, we did not have an opt-out policy. And so that very limited data that we would send, we would also have parents sign if they were so inclined and wanted us to share other information so that we could hook their longitudinal data so that we could look later on down the road to see where those children ended up. The parents would sign permission to do that. If they didn't, we only sent that little bit of data that was required under Part C of IDEA to send to the state. And so again, you have to be very mindful of that. And parents are the ones that get to say, my data is shared, except for in those places where IDEA speaks specifically to that. And that's a whole nother like 3-hour conversation about what that can look like. So.
We have another question in the chat. I am in Virginia where we see many children who are screened ineligible for Part B services, even with diagnosed conditions like vision impairments and autism. I heard you talk about trying to track children who had Part C, then were screened ineligible for Part B, and whether they come back needing services later on. Is there data about this already, and what trends are being seen?
So that really speaks to having that longitudinal data system or not, and whether or not when the child is in Part C, if they give permission for more information to be sent about diagnosis, all of those kinds of things. So it's an individual, you'll have to look at each individual state and see if you have a longitudinal data system. In an ideal world for those of us who are policy and data dorks, I'm going to say, we would like for that to happen, not to use for ill, but to use it for the good of the system so that we can really see is what we're doing at the Part C level, making a difference when kids get older. So, and wanting to know, it's not just to be nosy, but we also understand that there's some bad actors out there that sometimes want to take that data and not be so kind with it and use it for ill will to expose whatever. But I've not heard of anybody doing that myself, but we live in a different world than we did many years ago. So
so in Connecticut, we just passed a law in 2021 where if a child's not eligible for, so the child had early intervention, they're not eligible for Part B, our school districts are responsible to follow up with those families at 6 months and 12 months after turning 3 to see if they have concerns about their development, because we're concerned that, you know, the eligibility criteria is different between birth to 3 and Part B. So, you know, families still have concerns about their child's development. So they are responsible to follow up with those families, and also give them the opportunity to be able to either, you know, continue doing ASQs, or also download the Sparkler app and they can continue doing ASQs. So that has helped in some of our transition from C to B.
I do not see any additional questions in the Q&A queue. At this time, I think that's going to conclude our question and answer session. I'd like to turn it over to David Cantrell to close us out.
Thank you, Al. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Cantrell, the OSEP Deputy Director here in the Office of Special Education Programs within the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services here at the U.S. Department of Education. On behalf of OSEP and all of our presenters, thank you again for joining us today. If you have additional questions for our presenters or did not have an opportunity to ask a question, please enter your question into the chat. After this year's Smart Beginnings Conference, OSEP will continue to reach out via email to keep you updated on new resources and documents related to the topics that were shared during today's virtual conference. Additionally, you may access a recorded version of this year's event and review presentations from last year's Smart Beginnings Conference on OSEP's Ideas That Work website. As we close today's virtual conference, I want to remind all participants that you can earn continuing education units for your participation in Smart Beginnings this year. After the conclusion of Smart Beginnings 3-day event today, an email will be sent with a link to all participants with instructions on how to apply. Thank you again for your participation today.